Hi, welcome back to the YouTube channel. Today we're looking at A is for Academic English. I'm going to interview Lewis Rogers, and Lewis is an old friend, colleague. He's written many course books, a lot of them connected with exam preparation, but many connected with academic English. And he's been an academic English teacher in university settings as well. So he seems like a good person to ask about what is academic English as opposed to general English, and particularly how does it affect the materials writer? What is it as a writer that we do when we write materials for academic learners? In particular, Lewis is also going to be showing us extracts from his new self-published book, which focuses on academic grammar and academic English. Let's get talking to Lewis.
Hi. So my name's Lewis Rogers. I've worked in TEFL since I graduated. I went straight to Italy, then Germany and Portugal, and after about 5 years, decided to come back to the UK and do a master's in ELT at Nottingham Trent. And that was when I had my first experience of EAP. We were offered some teaching alongside the masters, and I started teaching students from largely from China, a little bit from the Middle East. Did that alongside the masters then, and then after that went to the University of Reading and became a full-time teacher there. When I first started, there was a real dearth of material. There weren't many options available for course books. There were some good ones, but it seemed a real vacuum in comparison to general English and business English that I'd been used to teaching, where you had an abundance of choice. And that was after a year or two of doing EAP. That was when I first thought, well, there's an opportunity here because there's a big gap in the market. There was almost no UK-based EAP material either. It was all American. And obviously I was teaching in the UK in the UK university context. And there were slightly different expectations, really, of what you wanted the materials to deliver and what they were delivering.
So, if we try to, for anybody who's watching who's not really familiar with English for academic purposes, if we were to talk about the key difference, if you compare, say, a general English course book with an EAP course book, can you sort of summarize the key differences?
Yeah, I suppose the easiest way to do it is to think about the students and what they have done in probably the 10 or 15 years that they've been learning English, and what they can't do when they come into the university context. So the vast majority of them had never written anything more than 200 or 300 words long. They've only ever really dealt with short text, short reading texts. They might have dealt with graded reader novels. And they've almost never, often not even in their own language, had to use sources to build an argument. So all of a sudden they're in a context where they've got to write a 1,000, 2,000 word essay based on research, integrate it and incorporate it in standard academic way with the referencing and the bibliographies and things. And they've never done this, often not even in their own language, let alone in English. It's quite hard. It's a huge challenge. And the volume of reading they have to do in order to write these essays, the volume of lectures they have to go to, seminars that they have to sit there and discuss the lecture for an hour on different angles, give presentations, lengthy presentations, again, based on research. I think it's these things. It's kind of like, if you think what the students have done in the 10 or 15 years they've been learning English and what they're now being asked to do, that for me is the difference. Like, their level could be quite good, it could be upper intermediate, but they've never done any of these tasks before.
And also, they might be upper intermediate. So there's those tasks that actually even people for whom English is their first language, they might not have university level study skills or academic skills like critical thinking and so on. So those can be integrated. But also, you talk about them, they might be sort of B2 level, upper intermediate. But I always imagine that in academic English, the big one of the big differences is vocabulary. Would that be right?
Yeah, it is. They encounter, like, when you there's something called the academic word list, which was a quite a long time ago now, maybe 20 years ago, a study Avril Coxhead did where she just looked at the frequency, what words commonly occurred outside of the top 2,000 words in English, in these academic texts and produced a set of just under 600 words that were high frequency, non-subject specific. So you have that kind of set. Then you also have all the subject specific vocabulary that they're having to encounter.
As a materials writer, when you're writing material, then how much are you referencing the academic word list, and how much also, if it's subject specialisms, where are you going to find that vocabulary that needs to be taught? What are your references?
So if you're writing published EAP material, it often doesn't get very subject specific because they want to use it on a pre-sessional course or a foundation program where the students are going on to a whole array of degrees. So it needs to stay in the general area. Where you get much more specific is something in the UK called in-sessional EAP. And that's where you're specifically supporting students, say, on a law degree, and that will be alongside the degree whilst that's happening. And the focus will be on the specific genres that they have to write in that subject area, the subject-specific vocabulary. But in EAP courses, a lot of published ones, there are a few specific ones, but a lot of them stay very broad. They stay general. They stay closer to the academic word list or collocations and phrases linked to that sort of area.
One other thing you mentioned, you said that you thought there was a difference between the American English academic publications and the British English. What are the differences?
I felt like they would use content material that wasn't necessarily that academic. You might have something that would be a debate from a radio show, which would be something I would think much more general English, a podcast or something like that. And so often the sources that students were having to build their essays on, either in the listenings or the reading text, I felt weren't very academic. And one of the things you're having to try and do often is push them away from quoting The Guardian or a podcast that they've listened to and push them towards genuine academic sources that have the clout required to back up their argument. So I didn't like how a lot of them, I felt like their source material wasn't academic enough.
I often see it as a sort of a scale from general to academic, because you've got general English at one end, academic at the other, and then there's a sort of you can place materials on a sort of a scale, and there's that middle scale. And I've written some of those materials where it may be stuff from newspaper where it's slightly more serious and academic in tone than the general English, but it's not quite at the stage where it's providing the kind of text they're going to have to read, an academic reading. So sometimes there'll be pictures with it and you'll exploit the pictures. And then you look at academic text and there's no pictures at all.
Yeah.
There's pages and pages of text.
Yeah.
Or a student will come to you and say, well, I need to understand this book about, academic science or something. And it's just a relentless text, probably written in a fairly inaccessible style. And unpacking that at that end of the scale, I think, is much more challenging for the writer.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's an award every year for the most inaccessible journal publication. Some of the things they have to deal with are very hard for them to comprehend. And I think a lot of the American stuff probably did fall in that spectrum that you're talking about. It was not quite academic enough, I felt.
But I think there's a lot of British English course books out there that still, and there is a demand for those books that are in the middle and they're used at university level and so on, because they're sort of a crossover between general and academic. And it's obviously within one group of students, it's always difficult to know where you're going to pitch it. You're going to get some who have real kind of strong certain academic needs more than others who perhaps haven't defined what their academic path is. So it's quite a hard.
Yeah, definitely. You have a lot of sort of EAP stroke general English courses in universities before they're on their degree or before they're on their foundation program. And I think those kind of books I was talking about would suit that context fine. My main context that I was working on at the time was the foundation program. So they're already on a course that they need to pass. So it's an equivalent to A levels. They don't have an equivalent to A levels from their own country. So they have to do this extra 1 year access program. And there's already expectations from their economics module or their politics module or their environmental science module that they can do this stuff. So you're teaching them as they're about to hand in assessments in December. You're trying to get them up to speed as quickly as possible, because they're going to have to write this environmental science essay with references, with bibliographies, understand all the lectures for the 2 or 3 months leading up to it, understand all the set textbooks and things. It's kind of, you have to really hit the ground running.
We've talked a bit about the sort of the teaching context and so on. Let's move more towards thinking about from the perspective of materials writers. We've talked about maybe EAP, you might be, it's in English, but you might be looking at study skills for learners. You might be looking at different types of reading texts, developing reading skills where they have to read longer texts and writing, produce much longer essays and so on. You just published a book on academic grammar and vocabulary, and I think what would be interesting to see some pages of that to see what the treatment of the vocabulary and the grammar is in academic writing. And because you just self-published it, maybe you can talk us through some of the extracts, what went into creating those pages and why you selected the vocabulary or the grammar that you have. So who is this targeted at? Is there a particular level, or what's the who's the?
It would be looking at students that are either on a pre-sessional or a foundation program. I mean, it'd be useful even for students that are actually on their degree and they're getting feedback from their teachers or lecturers, maybe on their choice of vocabulary or on the grammar that they're using. It would be useful self-study there as well.
In terms of CFR levels, what is this for B2 and above, or can you not?
Yeah, B2 and above, definitely. Yeah.
Should we take a look at the contents page then?
Yeah. So this is the first half. So it's split into two: vocabulary in the first half, grammar in the second half. And the syllabus is really put together to try and move away just from individual words in isolation. I mentioned the academic word list earlier, and there are quite a few exercises or pages where there are individual words, but there's also a lot on sort of collocations, like noun and preposition, verb and preposition, adjective noun collocations, giving them sort of more fixed phrases or chunks of language that they can use. So the grammar is where probably I think it differs more from general English. Like in general English and in academic English, it's about choosing sets of vocabulary on level that will be useful for learners to complete particular tasks. Grammar in academic English, you do less tense-based work. I don't know what you think, but I'd say probably 70, 60, I don't know, 50, 60% of a general English book will be quite tense driven.
Yes. Yeah.
And you don't use such a wide range of tenses in academic writing. I think the frequency count is something like 90% of an academic text is in either the present simple or the past simple.
Wow.
So you don't use such a wide range of tenses. You're not looking at past perfect, present perfect. The frequency in which those tenses are used is really quite low, and so you don't tend to go through all of the tenses in the same way that you would in a general English course. So here's an example of one of the grammar lessons or grammar self-study pages. And each section starts with a brief overview of the basic rules of that grammar point. So here we have first conditional, just a quick revision of how to structure the first condition. It doesn't go into real depth on that, but what it does start to look at is how that structure is used in academic writing, why it's important, where you can use it in your writing. So with the first conditional here, for example, project future income. So they outline the potential impact of an intervention or a discovery. They discuss probable implications, so useful in conclusions. They suggest what's likely to happen if a particular recommendation is followed. And they also suggest future actions, so used in recommendations in the discussion section. That towards the end of like the essay, it's that future research sort of angle.
I think it's really interesting because it goes back to what we were saying about there being a scale from general English to EAP, and you've got the sort of the general English uses of first conditions, those typical rules of likely outcomes and future implications, and then you move over to the usage in academic writing. And of course, lots of the students probably will have met those first conditional rules in 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they're looking at, but we're saying, well, in academic writing, it's also used in these ways. I think that's really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of it is an expectation of more often than not, the students will have met these grammar points, but they won't necessarily know how to use these grammar points in an academic context or know where it's typically used in a piece of writing. So these conditional sentences are typically used in conclusions and recommendations in academic writing.
So when you put this together in the book and you made those decisions about usage, what did you base that on in terms of research? Your own perception from just reading hundreds and hundreds of academic texts, or I mean, how did you come to those decisions?
So there's quite a lot based on experience of teaching, where students would typically make mistakes and what they overuse. We get a lot of students will overuse things that you might expect in IELTS style writing. So very personal sort of argumentative essay. You have to kind of try and push them away from that personal voice and that personal argumentation style. And they've probably spent like a year or two trying to get their IELTS score up and perfect that style of writing. And then you have to almost push them away from that. But then there's also been a lot of research done into this. Like one of the best known ones is by Biber. It's out like where it looks at the frequency of the grammatical structures, the most commonly occurring sort of ones in academic English. And that was where, reading that was when I first realized how unimportant almost tense-driven syllabus is. And you're like, is that true, really? And then you look at an article, you're like, oh yeah, it is all in the past simple and the present simple. And then it's the other structures that you're needing to get them to use conditionals, relative clauses, like complex sentences.
Should we take a look at the exercises that you've written that then follow? So once students have read that description, let's take a look at what the exercises you've written to help them.
And it's very much controlled practice, like quite typical exercises you'd find in a workbook or something like that. Because it is for self-study, it's not really for classroom use. I mean, teachers could, if they're using a course book that happens to have focused on conditionals or they've done problem solution vocabulary, they could use this in class, but it's typically more for self-study. So it's just multiple choice question on the first part here. Gap fill on the conditional sentences next. And then an error correction. So 2 to 3 controlled exercises, all of the examples academic in style, and then moves on at the end, a little bit of testing the sort of knowledge of the grammatical structure, or revising it, or the vocabulary. It's almost an alternative to like a definition match in the vocabulary. And and then an extension where they have to write the examples. So here, write sentences discussing a study, a project, or policy using first conditional to outline probable outcomes, focus on expressing likely results or implications, and then they're given some example sentences at the end there. I tried to include, with the examples, I've tried to include a range of academic writing. So there might be a sort of methodology approach where I've got passives. There might be something focusing on methodology. Here, obviously, this is more useful towards conclusions with the conditional conclusions and recommendations. But there's also students will have to do, sometimes depending on the degree they're going into, they might have to do quite a lot of reflective writing. So I've tried to include examples like that as well. So it's not all just standard academic essay style or like a chapter from an environmental science book or something like that. Try to include a range of genres that students might encounter.
Okay, great. Can we look at quickly look at an example from the vocabulary section of the book?
On the first page, just an introduction to the area, and anywhere between 8 and 12 words in a set, and just a definition and an example sentence on the first page.
Okay.
And then moves on to control practice. So typically something like a definition match, completing sentences or a paragraph with those words, possibly changing the word form, and then something else, checking either meaning or understanding, or perhaps another practice exercise, followed by a freer writing task and an example of example paragraph or example sentence level writing using some of that target language.
That's great. You've gone for quite sort of sentence level testing of the vocabulary and the grammar. Do you do any, whether in completing a text or anything like that?
Not longer than a paragraph. Not longer than a paragraph. So in the university context, you obviously only have your own classes that you're teaching, but you also get given personal tutees a lot of the time, and you may or may not teach them, but they'll come to you asking for advice, support, help. So their English teacher or their politics teacher might have said, you need to work on. So then they come and say, what should I go and buy? What should I go and get? And then you'd make recommendations of books. And I had like standard 3 books I used to go to that I'd recommend to them. And the reality was, like, they would typically be doing 2 content modules, English and academic skills. So they'd have multiple modules they were juggling, multiple assessments. And the reality was that they only had a limited amount of time to try and resolve these problems. And looking back on it, the books I was recommending was essentially recommending about 1,200 pages of self-study material.
Wow.
Each book would be somewhere between 300 or 400 pages, whether it was a vocabulary one, a grammar one, a research and referencing one, and they might need 1 or 2 of these. But then the reality is they've got a 1,500 word economics essay due next week. They've got a presentation in academic skills, and they've got a midterm test coming up in maths. They don't have a huge amount of time. Yes, they need to work on this as much as possible. They can to improve it. But they are juggling multiple demands. So I wanted something that was perhaps a little bit more efficient, that could cover a lot of bases, give a quick input, a quick revision, like the examples from the grammar there. When it does how this is typically used in academic writing, I am keeping that at sentence level, but I'm saying where this is normally used in academic writing. So when they come to write that economics essay and they've got to compare and contrast 2 academic theories, they'll be like, oh, okay, I need to go and have a look at that chapter and check that I'm doing this and doing that. And they haven't got to wade through loads of material again. They can just have a quick point of reference. I've now got to write a recommendation stage. What did that book say about where are you? What structures do I use for making a recommendation? I wanted it to be a quick thing that they could sort of pick up, use a little bit, wouldn't be massively onerous, because otherwise they just won't use it enough. If it's 300 pages, then they're just not going to use it.
I know you mentioned to me this is only part one. You've got another idea for a second book, is that right?
Yeah, so this is one of the issues with say doing self-publishing as opposed to writing for a publisher. Self-publishing, it can become as big as you want it to be, and it can do whatever you want it to do. And the book I was initially set out to do was going to become huge, and not everyone would need all of it. So you get a lot of people on, say, a foundation program who don't need necessarily the work on the vocabulary and grammar, but they don't know how to use sources. They don't know how to integrate them critically. They don't know how to do bibliography, that kind of thing. And I thought actually there are probably two different groups here. Some might need both. Some might only need the grammar and vocabulary. Some need the critical reading and source integration skills. A little bit how when I was at Reading University, you'd have those on the EAP module, but everyone did the academic skills module. So yeah, I separated out the two. So the next one, I'm hoping will come out early next year, and it'll be on research, referencing, critical thinking.
Okay, great. Well, we might bring you back when to see part two. So to do part two on A is for Academic English. Just as an aside, lots of people who watch these videos are interested in self-publishing. So in terms of, aside from the Academic English, very quickly, you did this using what kind of platform?
So this is on Amazon, and one thing I'd really recommend to anyone who's doing it for the first time, I was quite naive with some of it. I just typed it into a normal Word document, which is an A4 page, and you know about fit in publishing and making sure everything gets on the page. So I'm re-editing things to get that line back and typing this to get that line back. So it goes on 4 pages, the unit. I then go onto the Amazon platform, and you have to choose the size book you want. So I went off and had a look at my bookshelves and I thought, yeah, I'll go for that size. I measured it, clicked it, put it in, all over the place when you go onto the Amazon platform, because I'd written into A4, but then what I decided to print in wasn't A4. So all that editing to make it fit,
Right.
it then didn't fit. It took me about 4 days to get it to fit. I'm reworking it.
And you've done it as a print-based book, or it's available as an e-publication as well?
I'm going to do the E one. So I went print after having talked to a few other authors that had done self-publishing. They told me that 90% of their sales still came from print.
Wow.
Because it is a workbook where students will be circling things and writing in and stuff. I thought that makes more sense as print. But since it came out, I've actually had so I emailed different people I knew in universities who might find it useful. Quite a few have come back and said, can we get an e-version for the library?
Well, we will include a link to the Amazon link so people can go and buy the book from Amazon with this video. How much is it?
$9.99.
A bargain, an absolute bargain. Good. Well, hopefully you take a look at it. And it was really great talking to you, Lewis. Thanks for sharing your input on academic English. And I think it will be interesting to get you back to talk about book 2, because it's a kind of different area of academic English that perhaps people aren't quite so familiar with. So that would be great.
Yeah, what letters do you need to tick off next?
Oh, well, now we'd probably call it Academic English Part 2, or we could call it, I don't know.
Research and referencing. Have you
Okay, we'll do R's for research and referencing. Perfect, because we don't have many R's, it's 2. We have quite a few A's, quite a few E's and stuff like that. So yeah. Thanks very much to Lewis for sharing his insights and knowledge on the topic of academic English. I hope you found some useful ideas in there, some tips for your own writing. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you want to watch more videos in the future on the topic of writing language learning materials.